The wind screamed like a banshee, and the snow fell so thick it was like the sky had been torn open. 1 minute, Grace Hamilton was on a path. The next, she was lost in a world of white. Her hands were ice. Her lips were blue. Hope was a dying ember in her chest. She pulled her coat, a thing of thin wool and broken promises, tighter around her shoulders. It did nothing. The cold was a physical thing, a monster sinking its teeth into her bones. Her boots were soaked through. The hem of her dress was shredded. Every step was agony. But she kept moving. She had to. Stopping meant dying. She'd left town at dawn, a simple trip to her cousin's farm. But the storm wasn't on any forecast. It came out of nowhere, a cruel, sudden beast. The road disappeared. The trees became a repeating, terrifying pattern. Her horse, spooked by the ice, had thrown her and vanished into the white fury. Now it was just her, alone. Her breath plumed in front of her, the only sign of life in a dead landscape. She stumbled, fell. Her knees hit the frozen ground. She pushed herself back up, her muscles screaming. "Please," she whispered to a god she wasn't sure was listening. "Help me." The only answer was the howl of the wind. Then, through the swirling snow, she saw it. A shape, dark against the white. Not a tree, not a rock, a cabin. Smoke curled from its crooked chimney. A light, a single flickering candle, glowed in the window. It felt like a mirage. She tried to shout, but her throat was a desert. No sound came out. She forced her legs to move. One step, another. The world started to spin. Her body gave out just feet from the door. She didn't feel the impact. She only felt the cold. And then, nothing. Inside, Caleb Mason listened to the storm and stirred his soup. He was a man who preferred the company of the wind to the company of people. He lived alone. He worked alone. He planned to die alone. That was the way he liked it. But then he heard a noise. A soft thump against the outside wall. It was almost nothing, but it was enough. He stood, his chair scraping against the rough floorboards. He pulled on his heavy coat and opened the door. The wind and snow exploded into the room, cold and violent. He scanned the white darkness. Nothing. Then he looked down, and there she was. A woman, curled into a ball, already half buried in a fresh drift of snow. He didn't hesitate. He knelt, his own warmth forgotten. He brushed the snow from her face. It was pale, like marble. Her breathing was shallow, a tiny, fragile flutter. He didn't think. He acted. He scooped her up into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, like a bird with broken wings. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. He laid her gently on the rug before the hearth, the firelight dancing across her still face. He moved with a practiced speed, grabbing blankets, a basin of warm water, dry cloths. He'd done this for animals before. A fawn with a broken leg, a wolf caught in a trap, never a person. She was so still, too still. "Don't you die," he muttered, the words clawing their way out of his throat. "You don't get to die here." He worked quickly, pulling off her soaked boots, her wet dress. He wrapped her in layer after layer of thick wool quilts, tucking them around her. He chafed her hands, trying to force life back into them. Hours crawled by. The storm raged outside. Inside, there was only the crackle of the fire and the sound of her faint breathing. She didn't wake, but she was alive. For now, that was enough. Caleb sat in his chair, watching her. He didn't know who she was or what had brought her to his door. But as he looked at her face, tight with a pain he couldn't see, he felt a familiar, chilling dread. God hadn't sent her to his door. He knew, with a certainty that froze his soul, that something else had. Something much, much older. The first thing Grace saw when she opened her eyes was firelight dancing on a low, wooden ceiling. Her head throbbed. Her body ached with a deep, settled cold. For a moment, she was completely lost. This wasn't her room. It wasn't an inn. Then the memories came rushing back. The snow. The fall. The darkness. She pushed herself up on her elbows. She was wrapped in heavy quilts, lying on a pallet near a crackling fireplace. And across the room, a man sat watching her. He was tall and broad, with a thick beard and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, unshakable sadness. He held a metal cup in his rough hands. "You're awake," he said. His voice was low, like rocks tumbling in a slow river. Grace swallowed, her throat dry. "Where am I?" "My cabin," he said, not moving from his chair. "You collapsed outside, in the storm." She remembered. The cold, the feeling of giving up. "I thought I was going to die." "You were close," he said, his expression unchanging. "But you didn't." She looked down at the quilts, then back at him. "Thank you." He just gave a slight nod. "My name is Grace Hamilton," she offered, her voice still a whisper. "Caleb Mason." She studied him. He looked strong, weathered by the elements, but there was no threat in his eyes, just a profound weariness. He seemed safe. "I didn't mean to be a bother." "You weren't," he said. "The Lord provides." The way he said it felt different. Not like a platitude, but like a heavy statement of fact. Like he had seen proof. He stood and ladled some soup into a bowl, bringing it to her. "Eat this. Slowly." The soup was simple, just potatoes and broth, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It spread warmth through her, chasing away the last of the deep cold. She stayed for 3 days, waiting for the storm to break. Caleb was a quiet host. He chopped wood, tended a small goat in a lean-to, and sat by the fire, reading a worn Bible. He didn't ask her any questions about where she came from or where she was going. He gave her space, a quiet respect she wasn't used to. But there was something else in the cabin. Attention. A feeling of being watched, not by him, but by the house itself. The floorboards creaked in odd rhythms. The wind outside seemed to whisper her name. Sometimes, she would catch Caleb staring not at her, but at the empty corner of the room, his eyes filled with a strange mix of sorrow and fear. On the 4th morning, the sun finally broke through the clouds. "I can take you to town," Caleb offered. "The path should be clear enough for the wagon." She felt a pang of reluctance. As strange as the cabin felt, it was safe. The world outside was not. But she had to get to her cousins. She had to keep moving. "Thank you, Caleb." The town of Elkridge was just as she remembered it. Small, quiet, and judgmental. The moment Caleb helped her down from the wagon, the whispers started. They rippled through the street like a disease. "That's Caleb Mason." "Who's the woman with him?" "They say he found her in the snow." "She was with him for days. Alone." Faces turned away. Doors were shut. A woman physically pulled her child away as Grace passed. The judgment was a physical blow. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered, her hands clenched into fists. "I know," Caleb said, his voice tight. But it didn't matter. They were turned away from the inn. The pastor's wife, a woman known for her charity, looked straight through Grace as if she were a ghost. Every door was closed to her. Caleb watched, his jaw set like stone. A muscle twitched in his cheek. This wasn't just disappointment. It was rage, a deep, controlled fury that seemed to radiate from him. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Come back with me." That night, back in the oppressive quiet of the cabin, Grace finally broke down. "Why do they hate me so much?" Caleb stared into the fire, his face a mask of stone. "It's not you they hate, Grace. It's me." Before she could ask what he meant, He stood up and walked to a heavy wooden chest in the corner, one she had noticed was always locked. He produced a large iron key from his pocket and opened it. The air grew colder. He reached inside and pulled out a small, tattered dress. A child's dress. "This belonged to my daughter," he said, his voice hollow. "Her name was Sarah." He then pulled out a woman's shawl, finely woven and stained with something dark near the fringe. "And this was my wife's, Anna." He looked at Grace, and for the first time, she saw not just sadness in his eyes, but pure, undiluted terror. "They didn't die of a fever, Grace. They were taken, right from this cabin. The storm brought you here, just like it brought the thing that took them." Grace stared at the shawl, at the dark, ugly stain that marred its pattern. Her blood ran cold. "Taken? What do you mean, taken?" Caleb's hands were shaking as he placed the items back in the chest and locked it. The click of the lock echoed in the silent cabin. "The town doesn't understand. They think I did something. That winter, 6 years ago, the snow was just like this. One night, I went out to check on the animals. When I came back, they were gone." His voice cracked. There were no tracks, no signs of a struggle, just an open door in the cold. The town whispered. "They said a man doesn't just lose his family. They said I ran them off, or worse." He finally looked at her, his eyes pleading. "They think I'm a monster, Grace. That's why they looked at you that way. Because you were with me." A dozen horrifying thoughts crashed through her mind. The strange tension in the cabin, the way he stared at empty corners, the fear in the eyes of the townsfolk. Was it fear of him, or fear for him? "And you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you think happened?" "I know what happened," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Something came with the storm. Something old and hungry. I've seen it in the woods. A shadow that moves between the trees when it shouldn't. It took them, and it's still out there." He was mad. He had to be. Driven mad by grief and isolation. That was the only logical explanation. A man lost in his own sorrow, creating a monster to blame. And yet, the sincerity in his voice, the raw terror in his eyes, it felt real. "I can't stay here," she said, standing up. "I'm sorry for your loss, Caleb, but I can't." "You have to," he said, stepping in front of the door. "It knows you're here now. It was drawn to you in the storm. Leaving is the most dangerous thing you can do." "That's insane," she shot back, her fear turning to anger. "You can't keep me here." "I'm not keeping you anywhere," he said, his voice softening. "I'm trying to protect you. The town won't take you in. You have nowhere else to go. Stay, at least until the roads are fully clear." He was right. She was trapped between a town that hated her and a man who believed in monsters. She spent the next day in a state of high alert, watching Caleb's every move. He seemed harmless, spending his time chopping wood and reading his Bible. But at night, the cabin transformed. He would bar the door with a heavy wooden beam and stuff rags into the cracks around the single window. He didn't sleep. He sat in his chair by the dying fire, his old rifle across his lap, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. Grace lay on her pallet, feigning sleep, her heart hammering against her ribs. Was he protecting her from something outside, or was he making sure she couldn't escape what was inside? The second night he spoke to her, his voice low in the darkness. "They already think the worst of us," he said, his gaze still fixed on the window. "They think you're a fallen woman and I'm something else. Their whispers will follow you wherever you go." Grace didn't answer. "There's only one way to stop them," he continued. "One way to give us both a shield." She held her breath. "We have to get married." Her heart stopped. Married? To this man? This stranger who spoke of shadows and locked away his past in a chest? That's That's out of the question, she stammered. Is it? He asked, turning to look at her for the first time that night. The firelight cast strange shadows across his face. As my wife, you would be under my protection. Legally, socially. The pastor would have to recognize it. The town would have to accept it. They might not like it, but they would have to leave you alone. It's the only way you'll be safe. Safe from the town, or safe from him? He saw the doubt in her eyes. I would never harm you, Grace. I swear it on my family's memory. This would be a marriage in name only. A shield, for both of us. She stared at him, torn. On one hand, it was a mad proposal. On the other, what choice did she have? The town had cast her out. She had no money, no horse, nowhere to go. Marrying him would give her a roof over her head, food, and a name that, while feared, was at least respected enough to be left alone. It was a devil's bargain. A life of quiet fear in exchange for survival. Would you treat me with kindness? She asked, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. I would, he promised, his voice earnest. You would be safe here. Safer than you could ever be out there alone. She closed her eyes. She thought of the cold faces in town. She thought of the endless freezing snow. And she made a decision. All right, Caleb, she whispered into the oppressive darkness of the cabin. I'll marry you. The next morning, the air was heavy with their unspoken agreement. They rode to town in the wagon, the silence between them a living thing. When they walked into the small church, the preacher, Reverend Miller, looked as though he'd seen a ghost. Caleb, he said, his voice trembling slightly. We've come to be married, Caleb stated, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. The preacher's eyes darted to Grace, filled with a mixture of pity and terror. My child, he said, are you certain about this? Grace lifted her chin, forcing a confidence she didn't feel. I am. The ceremony was the coldest, most desolate affair she could have imagined. No flowers, no music, just the three of them in the empty, freezing church. The preacher's hands shook as he read from the Bible. When he said the words, I now pronounce you husband and wife, he couldn't even look Caleb in the eye. There was no kiss, just a grim nod from Caleb. As they walked out of the church, a stone clattered against the wooden steps near Grace's feet. She looked up to see Mr. Rayner, the shopkeeper, standing across the street, his face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. You'll regret this, he spat, his voice dripping with venom. He'll destroy you, just like he destroyed the others. The words of the shopkeeper, Mr. Rayner, echoed in Grace's mind all the way back to the cabin. He'll destroy you, just like he destroyed the others. Others? Plural? Caleb said nothing, his hands gripping the reins so tightly his knuckles were white. The silence in the wagon was heavier than any stone. Back at the cabin, the reality of her situation crashed down on her. She was a wife, his wife. She unpacked her meager belongings, her hands trembling. Caleb immediately went outside, swinging his axe into a log with a ferocity that terrified her. Each thud of the axe felt like a hammer blow against her own heart. The days that followed were a quiet, nerve-wracking torment. They lived as strangers under one roof. She cooked and cleaned, trying to make herself useful. He worked from sunup to sundown, avoiding her eyes, speaking only when necessary. At night, the ritual was the same. He barred the door, stuffed the window, and sat with his rifle, a silent, sleepless guardian watching the darkness. Grace lay on her pallet, pretending to sleep, wondering if the monster he feared was outside the cabin or sitting just a few feet away from her. She started to explore when he was out working. She didn't know what she was looking for. A clue. A sign. Something to prove he was either a madman or a murderer, or perhaps just a broken man telling a terrible truth. The cabin was small and held few secrets. But one afternoon, While sweeping near the hearth, her broom caught on a loose floorboard. Her heart leaped into her throat. With trembling fingers, she pried it up. Underneath, nestled in the dirt, was a small, leather-bound book. It was a journal. Anna's journal. Her hands shook so badly she could barely open it. The first pages were filled with the simple joys of a new wife and mother. Descriptions of the sunlight through the trees, the taste of wild berries, the first time her baby Sarah smiled. Grace felt a pang of guilt, like she was trespassing on a sacred memory. But she kept reading. As the entries moved closer to that fateful winter, the tone began to change. Anna wrote of Caleb becoming distant, watchful. He spends hours just staring into the woods. He says the shadows are getting longer. I told him it's just the season changing, but he won't listen. He's scaring me. The entries grew more frantic. Caleb has boarded up the back window. He says it's to keep the cold out, but it feels like he's trying to keep us in. He keeps talking about a debt that must be paid. He reads from the strange parts of the Bible, the parts about sacrifice and blood. Grace's breath hitched. This wasn't the journal of a happy wife. It was the journal of a woman living in terror. The final entry was dated the day before she and Sarah disappeared. The handwriting was jagged, panicked. The storm is here. Caleb is not himself. He says the king of the wood has come to collect his due. He said the snow demands a sacrifice. He looked at Sarah, and his eyes. They weren't his eyes. God help us. He is not my husband anymore. He is a monster. Grace slammed the journal shut, her body shaking uncontrollably. It was true. All of it. The town was right. He had done something to them. Sacrificed them to some dark entity he believed lived in the woods. She was married to a murderer. A madman who had killed his own family. And now she was his wife. Another sacrifice waiting for the next big storm. Panic seized her. She had to get out. She scrambled to her feet, stuffing the journal into her dress. She couldn't wait. She had to run now, while he was still out. She ran to the door, her hands fumbling with the simple latch. She pulled it open and gasped. Caleb was standing right there, his axe resting on his shoulder, his face grim. He had come back early. "Going somewhere, Grace?" he asked, his voice chillingly calm. She froze, her mind racing for an excuse. I was just getting some fresh air." His eyes narrowed. He saw the terror on her face. He saw the bulge of the journal in her dress. His gaze dropped to the floorboard near the hearth, which she had hastily replaced, but not perfectly. In that moment, he knew. His calm demeanor shattered. His face twisted into a mask of anguish and rage. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You shouldn't have looked." He took a step inside, and the monster from Anna's journal was standing right in front of her. "Give it to me, Grace," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. He held out his hand, not for the journal, but for her. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She backed away, her hands flying up to protect herself. "Stay away from me," she choked out, her voice trembling. "I know what you did. I read it." "You read words," he snarled, taking another step, cornering her against the far wall. "You don't know anything." He was right. She didn't. She only knew what she'd read, what she'd felt. The terror in Anna's final words was a living thing inside her now. She saw the same look in Caleb's eyes that Anna had described. A hollow, haunted madness. "You sacrificed them," she accused, the words tumbling out in a rush of terrified adrenaline. "To your king of the wood. You killed your own wife and child." The impact of her words was more powerful than any physical blow. Caleb flinched as if she'd struck him. The rage in his eyes flickered, replaced by a wave of pure, soul-crushing agony. He staggered back, his hand going to the rough-hewn mantel of the fireplace to steady himself. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, not like that. You don't understand." Then make me understand, she cried, her fear giving way to a desperate need for the truth. He looked at her, his face a ruin of grief. The thing in the woods, it's real. My family has lived on this land for generations. There's a pact, an old terrible pact. The land provides. It keeps the sickness away. It makes the crops grow. It protects us. But it demands something in return. He swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on some distant terrible memory. Every few generations, when a storm comes that is cold enough to freeze the heart of the forest itself, it collects. It takes a life. It's a debt. My great-grandfather paid it. My father was spared. I thought. I prayed I would be too. Grace stared at him, her mind reeling. He wasn't just mad. His madness had a history, a lineage. You let it take them? She whispered in horror. I tried to stop it, he roared, slamming his fist against the mantel. The cabin shuddered. I boarded the windows. I read the scripture. I stood guard every night. But it's not something you can fight with an axe or a gun. It whispers in your mind. It promises you things. It twists you. He sank to his knees, his head in his hands. It told me it only wanted one. That I had to choose. Anna or Sarah. How can a man choose? I refused. I told it to take me instead. But it laughed. It said the debt was in my blood, but the payment didn't have to be. It said it would take them both if I didn't choose. His body shook with silent sobs. I couldn't. I wouldn't. So that night, it came for them. I didn't sacrifice them, Grace. My refusal, my weakness, that's what condemned them. The story was monstrous, unbelievable. And yet, as she looked at the broken man kneeling before her, she believed him. She believed every insane, horrifying word. Because a man couldn't fake that kind of pain. The air in the cabin was thick with his confession. Suddenly, a frantic pounding on the door shattered the silence. Caleb! Caleb Mason, open up! It was the preacher, Reverend Miller. Caleb scrambled to his feet, wiping his eyes, and unbarred the door. The preacher stumbled in, his face pale and slick with sweat. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood Mr. Rayner and two other men from the town, their faces grim, their hands holding pitchforks and hunting rifles. What is the meaning of this, Reverend? Caleb demanded, his voice rough. Mr. Rayner pushed past the preacher, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. We know what you are, Mason, he spat. We've always known. My sister, Rayner continued, his voice shaking with hatred. Anna, she came to me a week before she disappeared. She told me you were mad, that you were talking about blood sacrifices and ancient debts. He pointed a trembling finger at Caleb. She was trying to leave you. You wouldn't let her. You kept her prisoner and then you killed her. You killed them both. That's not true, Grace heard herself say, stepping forward. All eyes turned to her. He's not a murderer. Rayner laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. And what are you? His next victim? Or his accomplice? We found your horse, girl. It didn't run off. It was found at the bottom of the ravine, its leg broken. He planned it all. He made sure you were stranded, that you'd have to come to him. The blood drained from Grace's face. Her horse. It wasn't an accident? Had he orchestrated everything? Was this entire nightmare, from the moment she was lost in the storm, a trap he had laid for her? Had he chosen her as the next payment for his debt? The men raised their weapons. The preacher held up a hand. There will be no mob justice here, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Just then, a terrible, unearthly howl echoed from the woods. It wasn't the sound of a wolf or the wind. It was something deeper, older, and filled with a chilling hunger. The men froze, their bravado evaporating into sheer terror. the temperature in the cabin plummeted. The fire in the hearth sputtered and died, plunging the room into a gray twilight gloom. Outside, the snow began to fall again, thick and unnaturally fast. The storm had returned. Caleb looked at Grace, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the men and their guns. "It's here," he whispered. "It's come for the new bride." The howl came again, closer this time, a sound that seemed to scrape against the very bones of the world. The men from the town, who had come ready for a confrontation with a man, were completely unprepared for this. Their faces went slack with a primal fear. "What in God's name was that?" one of them stammered, his rifle shaking. "It's the devil himself," Mr. Rayner whispered, his face ashen. He looked at Caleb with a new kind of horror. He had believed Caleb was a monster of flesh and blood, a simple murderer. The reality was infinitely worse. "The King of the Wood," Caleb said, his voice grim. He grabbed his own rifle from its place by the door. "Bar the door, now!" The men, spurred by a terror that overrode their hatred, slammed the heavy wooden beam into place. The cabin was plunged into a suffocating darkness, broken only by the thin gray light from the single window. Outside, the world went silent. The wind stopped. The snow fell without a sound. It was a dead, waiting silence that was more terrifying than the howl had been. "It's playing with us," Caleb breathed, his eyes scanning the window. "It likes the fear." Grace's mind was a whirlwind of terror and confusion. Caleb's story, Anna's journal, Rayner's accusation, her horse. And now this. A monster at the door. Had Caleb planned all this? Was she the intended sacrifice to appease this thing? Or was he telling the truth, and they were all trapped in a nightmare he had been living for 6 years? A soft scratching sound came from the roof. Slow, deliberate, like a giant cat dragging its claws across the shingles. The men looked up, their eyes wide. Then a new sound. A whisper. It came from all around them, seeming to seep through the very walls of the cabin. Grace? Her name. It was a dry, rasping sound, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. She clapped her hands over her ears, but it did no good. The voice wasn't in the air. It was in her head. "It's a trick," Caleb said, his voice tight. "Don't listen to it." The scratching on the roof stopped. A heavy thud shook the entire cabin, as if something immense had just landed on the porch. Then a soft, gentle tapping on the door. Tap, tap, tap. It was a polite, almost delicate sound, more terrifying than any roar. "Don't open it," the preacher warned, his voice a prayer. "Let me in, little bride," the voice whispered in Grace's mind. "He can't protect you. He offered you to me. A trade, your life for his peace." "He's lying!" Caleb shouted, his eyes locked on Grace's. "I would never—" "Liar!" Rayner screamed, pointing his shaking rifle at Caleb. "This is your doing? You summoned it?" The cabin was a tinderbox of fear and accusation. The men were turning on each other, their sanity fraying. The tapping on the door stopped. A moment of silence. Then the wood of the door began to groan, to splinter from the outside. A single, long black claw, curved like a scythe and sharp as a razor, punched through the thick oak near the latch. It was followed by another, and another. The men screamed. One of them, in a blind panic, raised his rifle and fired. The shot went wide, shattering a clay pot on the mantel. The creature outside let out an enraged shriek, a sound of pure fury. The claws ripped downward, shredding the door like paper. "The cellar!" Caleb yelled, grabbing Grace's arm. He dragged her toward a trap door in the floor she had never noticed before. He threw it open, revealing a dark, stone-lined hole. "Get in! All of you!" The preacher and the other men scrambled for the opening, falling over each other in their haste to escape. Rayner hesitated, his hatred for Caleb warring with his terror of the thing outside. The door exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the swirling snow, was a thing of nightmares. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs too long, its body covered in what looked like matted, dark fur and strips of peeling bark. Its head was like that of a stag, with a crown of jagged black antlers, but its face was horribly, terrifyingly human, with two burning, intelligent eyes. It fixed its gaze on Grace. "There you are," the voice echoed in her mind. Raynor finally broke, screaming as he dove for the cellar. Caleb pushed Grace toward the opening. "Go! I'll hold it back." "No!" she cried, grabbing his arm. "I'm not leaving you." She didn't know why she said it. She didn't know if he was a hero or a villain. She only knew that in that moment, he was the only thing standing between her and that monster. The creature took a step into the cabin, its hooved feet clicking on the floorboards. It ignored Caleb, its burning eyes still locked on Grace. It saw her as the prize. "It's you it wants," Caleb said, his voice filled with a terrible resignation. "The debt has to be paid." He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the truth. He wasn't going to fight it. He was going to give it what it wanted. He was going to give it her. Caleb shoved her toward the cellar. "Get down there!" But it wasn't a gesture of protection. It was a move to get her out of his way. His face was a mask of grim determination. He wasn't planning to hold the creature back. He was planning to make a deal. The creature took another step into the room, its massive antlered head nearly scraping the ceiling. It moved with an eerie, unnatural grace. It ignored the cowering men in the cellar. It ignored Caleb. Its entire focus was on Grace. "The bride comes with me." The voice in her head rasped, and she felt a cold dread that was worse than any fear she had ever known. It wasn't going to kill her. It was going to take her. "Wait!" Caleb shouted. The creature paused, turning its burning eyes to him for the first time. There was an intelligence there, an ancient, malevolent cunning. "You want the debt paid?" Caleb called out, his voice shaking but firm. "The pact is with my bloodline, not hers. The debt is mine to pay." He took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Take me. Let her go." The creature seemed to consider this. It tilted its great head, a grotesque parody of curiosity. "You refused the choice once before, son of Mason. You let both the doe and the fawn perish. Why offer yourself now?" "Because I was a coward then," Caleb said, his voice thick with shame. "I let my fear destroy my family. I won't make that mistake again." He looked at Grace, his eyes filled with a final, desperate apology. "I'm sorry, Grace, for all of it, for bringing you into this." He then turned back to the creature. "A life for a life. That's the pact. Take me and leave this place in peace." It was the ultimate sacrifice. The truth she had been searching for wasn't in a journal or in the whispers of the town. It was here, in this moment. He wasn't a monster. He was a man, haunted and broken, trying to atone for a failure that had cost him everything. "No!" Grace screamed, stepping out from behind him. She stood between Caleb and the creature, her small frame trembling but resolute. The monster's burning gaze fell upon her once more. "You will not take him," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The creature let out a low growl, a sound like grinding stones. "This is not your affair, little bird. The debt is old." "Then the debt is wrong," she declared. "This land, this family, they don't owe you anything. Your reign of fear is over." She didn't know where the words were coming from. They were a torrent of defiance, a rebellion against the ancient, terrifying power that stood before her. In the cellar, Mr. Raynor watched, his mouth agape. He had spent 6 years hating Caleb, convinced he was a human monster. But now he was witnessing a battle against something truly demonic, and the man he hated was trying to sacrifice himself to save them all. The creature took a menacing step forward, lowering its antlered head. It had not been challenged in centuries. "You are brave," the voice sneered in her head. "Your courage will taste sweet." It raised a clawed hand. This was it. It was over. But then, something happened. As the creature lunged, Grace did the only thing she could think to do. She held up her hand, not to defend herself, but in a gesture of peace, and she started to pray. Not a prayer of fear, asking for deliverance, but a prayer of power. Words from the Bible that Caleb had been reading every night. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." The creature recoiled as if struck. The words seemed to burn it. A hiss of steam rose from its dark hide. It shook its massive head, confused and enraged. Caleb stared, dumbfounded. He had fought this thing with iron and prayer, but his prayers had always been whispered in fear. Hers were a declaration of war. She took a step forward, her voice growing stronger. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" The creature shrieked, a sound of agony this time, and stumbled backward. The burning light in its eyes flickered. The shadows that clung to its form seemed to thin and retreat. It was not a physical being in the way they understood. It was a creature of shadow and fear, and her absolute faith, her refusal to be afraid, was like a searing light, a weapon it could not defend against. "Get out!" she commanded, pointing toward the broken door, "and never return!" With a final ear-splitting roar of fury and pain, the creature dissolved. Not in a flash of light, but like smoke caught in a strong wind. It simply unraveled, the shadows and bark and fur turning to mist and blowing out through the open door into the storm. And then it was gone. The cabin was silent. The unnatural cold receded. The fire in the hearth, as if by a miracle, sputtered back to life, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. The storm outside abruptly ceased. Sunshine, brilliant and white, streamed through the doorway. It was over. Slowly, hesitantly, the men climbed out of the cellar. They stared at the splintered door, at Grace, at Caleb, their faces filled with awe and disbelief. Mr. Rayner was the last one out. He looked at Caleb, his eyes filled with the dawning horror of his 6-year mistake. I'm sorry," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. "I was so wrong. Can you ever forgive me?" Caleb didn't answer. He was looking at Grace, his face a mixture of shock, gratitude, and a love so profound it was breathtaking. He walked toward her, his steps unsteady. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, as if to make sure she was real. "You saved us," he whispered. "You saved me." "No," she said, her own eyes filling with tears. "We saved each other." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, and for the first time the cabin didn't feel like a prison or a place of sorrow. It felt like a home. The summer sun rose slow and golden over the hills, touching the newly repaired cabin roof like a blessing. The air smelled of fresh grass, warm earth, and the sweet perfume of wildflowers. Grace stood on the front porch, a bowl of fresh eggs in her hands, and watched as Caleb worked in the garden they had planted together. He moved with a lightness she had never seen in him before. The heavy weight of grief and fear had been lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a quiet, steady joy. The town of Elkridge had changed. The story of that night had spread like wildfire, a tale of monsters, sacrifice, and a faith so powerful it could banish the darkness. They were no longer outcasts. They were legends. Mr. Rayner had become their staunchest defender, and the pastor spoke of Grace's courage from the pulpit every Sunday. People would stop by now, and then, not with suspicion, but with gifts, a pie, a bolt of cloth, a bag of nails. They came to thank the man and woman who had faced the darkness that had haunted the edges of their town for generations, and won. One evening, Caleb led her out to a clearing by the creek. There, under a large oak tree, was a small wooden bench he had built. Carved into the back were 2 words: "For Grace." They sat together, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. "I never thought I'd feel peace again," Caleb said softly, taking her hand. "You brought the spring back into my life, Grace." She leaned her head on his shoulder. Theirs was a love story born not of convenience or romance, but forged in the heart of a supernatural storm. They had faced down a literal monster, but in doing so, they had also conquered the monsters within: fear, grief, and hatred. They had found not just survival, but salvation. In a quiet corner of the world, on a plot of land that had once demanded a terrible price, they had planted something new. They had planted hope, and it had bloomed into a beautiful, unshakable love. If this story of faith and courage moved you, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and ringing that notification bell. Your engagement helps us continue to bring you stories that matter, tales of light overcoming the darkness. We are deeply grateful for every one of you. We'll see you in the next one.